Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Drawing School's Creative Conversation series. This evening, we're going to be having a discussion about the relationship between botany, plant life, and art with the curator Gina Buenfeld-Murley and artist and researcher Gemma Anderson. And I'm really glad to be bringing together, or bringing to the foreground this evening, our creative engagement with non-human life forms and plant life in particular. Partly because over the last year at the drawing school, we've been developing a green drawing program, trying to think carefully or more carefully about drawing as a green and sustainable art form, and to try and investigate the crises of representation we face in relation to the climate change emergency. And one of the new online courses we launched this term focused on plants and was titled Plant Time. So I'm really delighted to bring Gina and Gemma together this evening as two botanical minds to discuss different ways of thinking about and understanding plant life through visual art. So to introduce Gina and Gemma a little further and give you a bit of background on their work. Gina is exhibitions curator at Camden Art Centre in London, and she most recently curated the Botanical Mind exhibition, which is, the full title is Botanical Mind, Art, Mysticism and the Cosmic Tree. And that was really the kind of prompt for our discussion this evening. But she's also curated numerous other exhibitions, ranging from an exhibition on psychorealism, exhibitions on Bonnie Camplin and Rose English, as well as independent curatorial projects at Newlyn Art Gallery and in Turku in Finland. And in 2017, she participated in a curatorial program in Helsinki, and since then has been researching the place of plants within indigenous cultures in Europe and in South America, including a field research trip in Finnish Lapland. And she's also spent extended periods of time in the Colombian, Peruvian and Brazilian areas of the Amazon rainforest. She's also spent time with indigenous communities in the rainforest, learning about indigenous poetics and the function of abstract art and music in facilitating communication between the plant and animal kingdoms. So we also are welcoming this evening Dr. Gemma Anderson, who's an artist and researcher and currently co-investigator on the Art, Science and Philosophy HRC funded project Representing Biology as Process at the University of Exeter. She's collaborated on a number of innovative art and science projects, including Hidden Geometries with the Maths Department at Imperial College in London, and Isomorphology and the Cornwall Morphology and Drawing Centre at CAST and with the Natural History Museum in London. Gemma has also published widely on drawing, including in her book Drawing as a Way of Knowing in Art and Science, which was published in 2017. And she's also written academic articles such as Drawing as a Way of Knowing in Art and Science, and has produced a limited edition artist book series. One of those, the title is Portraits, Patients and Psychiatrists with the Wellcome Trust, and another on isomorphology. And most recently, her work has been shown as part of the exhibition Critical Zones, Observatories for Earthly Politics at the Centre for Art and Media in Germany. And of course, her work was also exhibited in the Botanical Minds exhibition at the Camden Art Centre. So it's going to be really interesting to hear Gemma's response to having her work displayed in this context. So welcome, Gemma and Gina. And just a quick sort of introduction on the exhibition that Gina's curated and that she'll be telling us much more about. It's both an exhibition, or it was an exhibition at the Camden Art Centre, but it also has a sort of more permanent life online. And there's a whole sort of series of resources, visual and textual, that you might want to look at following this discussion. And it really brings together a rich and wide-ranging array of sources, drawing on indigenous traditions from the Amazon rainforest, alternative perspectives on scientific rationalism and new thinking around plant intelligence, philosophy and cultural theory, to investigate the significance of the plant kingdom to human life, consciousness and spirituality across different cultures and periods of time. So to start us off, Gina's going to introduce a few of the kind of defining themes of the exhibition, and then we're going to talk with Gemma in a bit more depth about her research at the intersection really of science and art. And let me remind everyone listening that you're really welcome to post comments or questions in the chat as we go along, or you can wait to the end of the discussion and raise your hand in the participants tab, and then you can speak directly to us. So yeah, welcome both of you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So thank you for the introduction and for the invitation also to come and speak to everyone that's listening, and hello to everyone that's there. It's often quite disconcerting giving these presentations when I can't see you. And to that end, I might just say that I may have some technical difficulties going through the presentation. We've just had some internet problems, so please bear with me if that does happen. We'll do our best to get through the presentation. I was really thrilled to be invited to speak with Gemma, because Gemma's someone that I've known for several years now, and we've had a really rich and rewarding conversation about many shared interests and ideas that inform both of our research practices. So I'm looking forward to this evening very much. I'll just start the presentation and let's hope for the best. Can everybody see that first slide?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so the introduction that I'll give this evening is anchored, as Claudia said, to an exhibition that I recently co-curated with Martin Clark at Camden Art Centre, where I'm a curator. So the Botanical Mind, Art Mysticism and the Cosmic Tree is a transgenerational group exhibition kind of anchored to the idea of the plant and exploring plant consciousness, plant intelligence, in a way to then unpack many other ideas within culture, within society, mythology, and within science. So the beginning of this exhibition goes back several years for me. When I was in the Colombian rainforest, I was lucky enough to have a research fellowship supported by the British Council, and I was introduced to an artist called Abel Rodriguez, who is an indigenous artist from the Colombian region of the Amazon rainforest. He's now living in Bogota in the city, but he's someone who grew up learning about plants embedded within this amazing rainforest where he lived. And when he was in the city and started to work with Tropenbos International, an NGO that's responsible for preservation of rainforests and indigenous knowledge, started to convey what he knew and what resided in his memory through drawing. So this really intrigued me, the sense in which drawing from memory, using it as an imaginative resource, is a way of conveying scientific and botanical knowledge. Can everyone see the slide there of Abel's work? Is it moving through? Okay. Yep. Okay. So I spent longer periods of time in different regions of the Amazon, including in the Brazilian and Peruvian regions of the Amazon. And what struck me, having sort of had this introduction through Abel's work, was that most of the art that I was seeing in indigenous cultures was abstract, not representational. And as I learned more about geometries, I learned that they're intrinsic to their cosmology, their way of understanding their place within the natural world and also their spirituality. So these aren't just decorative patterns. I'm moving through now. Is that moving through for you, Claudia?
We've still got the beautiful textiles. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, that's it. Perfect. So the Huni Quinn people, who we were just looking at, some of the work from their artisans, that those sacred geometries for them relate to the life field. They represent sacred entities, whether they be plants or animals. In particular, the pattern of the jiboya, the snake, the serpent, that's very sacred in their culture. And when I was in the Peruvian region of the Amazon, I was really struck, and this was really the starting point for the exhibition, by these designs by the Shipibo Conibo people. So these patterns, which are extremely distinctive, and this slide shows some of them actually in the exhibition, relate to their work with a sacred and very powerful plant medicine called Ayahuasca. So although there's no sort of representation of the plant in these textiles and in these designs, they're nonetheless very much intrinsic to their work with this plant, which is used in sacred ceremonies for psychoactive and spiritual transformation. These are what they believe interlace the natural world, that kind of unifies everything that exists and relates to the work that they do with music and with plant medicine to heal the body. So sort of bringing the body back into alignment energetically. And this is an area that Gemma and I have spoken about before, and hopefully we'll touch on a little bit this evening, because in Gemma's work, she's also using quite similar kind of abstract forms, energetic landscapes in a way to imaginatively explore the natural world and the sort of fabric of existence, if you like. So, you know, then I came back to England and started to think about this exhibition and started to talk to my co-curator about some of these ideas around pattern and music as being ways to communicate and represent the natural world. And, you know, started to think also about European and North American traditions and the work of many surrealist and modernist artists who'd been inspired also by these sacred geometries. So this slide, hopefully you're seeing this as well, shows Annie Albers and Joseph Albers' work. They spent periods of time and made, you know, countless visits really to Central, Meso and South America, and were really inspired by sacred sites, these pre-Columbian geometries. And for Annie Albers in particular, she was really moved by the sort of abstract forms within Peruvian textiles, Andean weavings, which she refers to as her great teachers. And this piece on the left, she refers to as a form of communication, a type of ancient writing. And Yves Leloy, another early 20th century artist often associated with the Surrealist movement, who was inspired by the Navajo sand paintings. So again, there's a quite kind of evident relationship between these geometries and a sort of feeling of music or dynamism or an energy landscape. So this was really what inspired us in thinking about the show and thinking about the relationship between mathematics, geometry and music, which, you know, it isn't particular to Native America or indigenous cultures in the Amazon, but has fascinated philosophers and, you know, natural philosophy and going right back to antiquity in Europe with Pythagoras, who first sort of formalized the diatonic scale, making visible, in a sense, this relationship between music. So in the plant kingdom, these geometries are very present. You know, we see spiral and sacred geometries. We see sort of fractal forms as well. And this has fascinated not only scientists and philosophers, but artists, of course, through time. So Ernst Haeckel was a 19th century kind of a polymath, really, a biologist, a zoologist, also an artist, who was fascinated by these forms that replicate across the animal, mineral, and vegetal kingdoms. This is something that hopefully Gemma and I will also talk about later, because it's so central to her work in isomorphology. So looking at how these forms that repeat and re-emerge in all kingdoms of the natural world, in a sense, could be thought of as blueprints for the natural world. And within them lies perhaps some kind of intelligence through which not only can different life forms communicate, but through which all of life is expressed. So this is really the sort of, has been a source of inspiration for many artists, visionary artists in particular, and outsiders or self-taught artists. So the manuscript here that I'm showing one page of, the Voynich manuscript, is a 15th century codex, which is a kind of cosmological and botanical document. It's extremely mysterious, has never been deciphered. It's a script that no one knows how to decipher. And it shows the relationship between plant forms and the celestial realm. So here we're looking at these quite mandala-like forms, which could either be the sort of centripetal formation of flowers and the arrangement of petals, or it could be some kind of celestial formation in the heavens. And this idea about correspondences between all aspects of the natural world, from the greatest to the smallest, from the cosmic to the subatomic, is really an idea that ran through the exhibition, thinking about these kind of implicit intelligences and expressions in the natural world, and how, you know, within European thought, the idea of geometry or natural science wasn't separate from the idea of spirit. So spirit being implicit within matter, a sort of animating life force within our bodies, within plants, within animals, was just a kind of given of everyday life. And it was only with the scientific revolution and the growing dominance of a very mechanistic way of seeing the world that these two ideas of spirit and matter were split apart. So one of the things that interested me in Gemma's work in particular, and bringing her into this exhibition, was her work and her collaboration with scientists and with a philosopher of science, who's really focusing on a kind of alternative to the mainstream, I suppose, an alternative way of thinking science that is more processual, that's about dynamics, that's about kind of changes in energy and movements, rather than these kind of mechanized units of matter. So the kind of focus of the exhibition in some ways is the moment that preceded that scientific revolution. So going back to the medieval era, these visionary artists that sort of understood how the human animal is intrinsically linked to the vegetal. So artists like Hilma af Klint, who saw these bodies very much as part of plant forms. Minnie Evans, a self-taught artist, an African-American artist, who again saw this kind of animated life force in the vegetal kingdom. And Anna Zemenkova, a Czech artist from the early 20th century, who would get up every day and make a portrait of a plant, very much sort of channeling its spiritual energy. Are you seeing the Anna Zemenkovas at the moment? Is it moving through okay? Yeah, okay. So with Anna Zemenkova, you know, she was very much looking at these kind of repetitive forms in a way, these units which repeat in plant morphology. And in a way, I think that's what is so interesting about plants and art and this overlap, because their forms are both kind of decorative and sort of representational in a way. You know that you're looking at a plant, but at the same time quite abstract, because these units which repeat, they have sort of rhythmic qualities which almost naturally abstract themselves. So the exhibition is transgenerational. It's looking at contemporary artists, including Gemma, Joachim Koester, who I'm showing on this slide, who are fascinated with plant forms. So Joachim has photographed both cannabis and cocaine, which is a substance that's derived from the coca plant, using SEM technology, so an electron scanning technology that shows these kind of landscapes that are created on the microscopic scale of the plant. And we also showed a lot of artists that are working with automatic techniques or exploring automatism. So Aithel Cahoon, who was an artist who was born in India, but a British artist who lived both in London and in Cornwall, who was an occultist, very much associated with ideas of Hermeticism, and sort of harnessed these natural principles and energies in the natural world, in the work, to allow these forms to express themselves, if you like. So she used an automatic technique called decalcomania, with which paint is poured onto a surface and then pressed on top to allow these sort of mantic stains to emerge. And another artist, a contemporary artist, Kirsten Bratch, who collaborates with different artisans, and in this particular piece was working with a marbling technique. So putting these sort of pigments and oils into liquid, into a pool of water or other liquid, and then pressing the paper on top. So through these processes, you can see these kind of forms, which, as I mentioned before, repeat both in the kind of cosmological scale, the astral sphere, and also right down in the microscopic. So this, in a way, this ambiguity in this image could be on either of those spectrums. And Bruce Connor, an artist who sort of very much associated with the countercultural movement in West Coast America in the 60s and 70s, who used ink blot techniques. So he would score and fold paper to create these kind of symmetrical forms, which really sort of relate to me to the plant kingdom, you know, which is full of symmetries and repetition. And the final work that I just wanted to mention is Henri Michaud, who experimented with a sacred plant medicine, mescaline, and drew in it through a sort of a form of automatic writing, if you like, these visions that he had on the sort of inner realm of his mind. And that was also a theme which we explored in the exhibition, the way that these patterns and forms repeat not only through the different realms of the physical universe, but also within the sort of inner realm of the mind. So that was what I wanted to say to introduce the exhibition. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Gina. It's really fascinating. So much to think about there, really rich, and to see so many really beautiful works. It's so intriguing, this sort of how you've brought together, you know, works across different generations through time, but also across different media. And I know we talked a bit before when we met about the textiles that you'd incorporated, and I was really struck by that idea of a kind of plant music and the relationship to spiritual transformation and to healing. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more, just before we move on, about your kind of personal experience learning. I think you described it as plant wisdom, which is a lovely way of putting it, in the Amazon and elsewhere, I think, within communities.
Sure. So the time that I spent with different indigenous peoples, from the Shipibo to the Yawanawa, who I actually spent the longest period of time with, the sort of consistent explanation that I was given for where they gained their knowledge of plants from was that it was given to them from the plants themselves. And this isn't kind of incidental trial and error knowledge. It's extremely precise, detailed information that they say they receive as a transmission from plants through musical form often. And the way that they gain this information is by taking what are called dietas. So removing themselves from social contact, going into the jungle, into solitary isolation for really long periods of time, and just dieting with one plant in order to sort of bring themselves into an attunement with it. But the most kind of inspiring plant that I learned about was ayahuasca. So their knowledge of this sacred plant, which needs to be mixed with a particular other plant in a certain way so that it has the effect on both body and mind, came to them. You know, most of the indigenous peoples that I spoke to say this through a vision from the plant itself. So those textiles that I was showing you, they really relate to their work with this plant medicine. And under the influence of it, many people report a kind of synesthesia. And that was very much what my experience with it is. So you might hear a sound, but you experience it as a vision, or, you know, the inverse. You might see something and you know that it's musical. In a way, those modalities are not separate. You're encountering the thing in its pure form before it's separated out into these different extrapolations, I suppose, through the senses. So those visions, some people say that they're scores in a way, that each one has a song. And that was the way it was introduced to me by an indigenous Shipibo woman who was weaving these textiles. She said, well, this one is this song, and this is a different type of song, and we sing each different song to bring about a certain kind of healing. So one might be to heal lovesickness, one might be to heal something else. And the musical counterpart, which is called ikoro, it's a kind of healing song in the Shipibo tradition, is extremely distinctive, just as the visuals are. You know, they're unmistakably by the Shipibo Konibo people. And the music is percussive, it's chanting, it's it kind of enlivens the energy in the body, particularly when you're drinking ayahuasca. So although they kind of share a sort of stylistic idiom, each one is also individually distinct and has its own very specific coding in a way. They almost look like computer coding somehow. So yeah, I mean, to me, that was just extraordinary that there's this kind of, an interplay, a relationship between music and visual abstraction. And then that took me into this research into, European antiquity and ideas like music of the spheres and, you know, these ideas which are really present here also.
Yeah, and just I was struck by how, you know, how much that connected with the works that you were showing from kind of the early 20th century with the Albers, you know, works, and just how important synesthesia and kind of pure abstraction was to that group of artists, well, across Europe, but and that those connections were really, really fascinating to hear about. Should we move on to Gemma, just so that we make sure we've got time for discussion and to think about some of these themes that move across both your work and thinking? Hi, Gemma.
Hello. Is my screen shared? Oh, hang on. Here we go. Yeah?
Yeah, perfect. Great.
Okay, thanks, Claudia, and thanks, Gina, for that talk. That was great. Really nice to go through some of the works again and very inspiring. Okay, so I am going to talk about the work that was mentioned, the isomorphology work, and then kind of take you through a bit of a narrative to get to the work that was in the Botanical Mind, which is a series of drawings of protein mazes. And so to do this, I'll tell a bit of a story, which I'll call a kind of arc of practice. So this is really from observational drawing of patterns and morphological resemblances, which is isomorphology, to simulation of theoretical morphology. It's a kind of Urfland's Goethean kind of drawing activity through a drawing-based algorithm, and that's isomorphogenesis. And then we'll get to the protein maze, which is part of the project that Claudia mentioned and Gina mentioned about representing biology as process. So that's about using drawing to explore specific biological processes. Okay. Yeah, okay, so isomorphology is a comparative drawing-based method of inquiry into the shared forms of animal, mineral, and vegetable morphologies. So for a long time, for quite a few years, I was drawing objects, specimens from museum collections, from scientific collections, from the field, and I was observing these forms and symmetries. So for example, bilateral symmetry, fivefold symmetry, spirals, hexagons, branching forms, etc. The things that we recognize here, and they're in the list. In the zoology, you know, animal kingdom, in plants and in minerals. And the more I noticed these resemblances, the more I became interested in, you know, other documentation of these relationships. And I looked into this, and then I couldn't find anything specifically. There's lots of documentation about patterns in nature in general. but nothing specifically about the kind of resemblances between the animal, the mineral, and the vegetable. And so then this, triggered really the beginning of a PhD research project for me. So isomorphology began with questions that were generated through drawing, and in turn, drawing was used to address these questions. Okay, so this is a photograph of my working space, my desk at the Natural History Museum, and so you can see that there are specimens here from the herbarium, from the mineralogy department, and from the zoology department. And I can't sort of emphasize enough how challenging it was to, first of all, negotiate with the Natural History Museum to have a workspace, like a desk at the museum. This was in 2011, and it went on for a couple of years. And then to also sort of form relationships with all the different curators of the collections, and to ask them to bring the specimens together into this workspace just for a day or two for me to draw them, when normally these specimens never see each other. They're in completely different places in the museum. And so this was a real kind of disruption of the scientific order and a kind of intervention into the scientific collections. And then based on having these specimens which had these resemblances, and that's the reason that we brought them together, I then worked on copper plates. I improvised the drawings based on the resemblances and let the morphology kind of play and intersect, and to show the relationships rather than the differences. Okay, so yeah. So as such, isomorphology acts as an alternative kind of extra scientific form of classification. And then this got me into working with philosophy of science, really, and with philosopher of science John Dupre, who I'm working with at the minute. He says there are countless legitimate, objectively grounded ways of classifying objects in the world, and these may often cross-classify one another in indefinitely complex ways. So this, I suppose, in theory, then isomorphology was also providing a kind of alternative visual approach to classification and challenging the Linnaean approach that we know, the conventions. So here's one of the etchings, and this is radial symmetry in animal, mineral, and vegetable specimens. And I suppose when you're looking at this image, I hope that you'll start to ask the question, what is animal, what is mineral, and what is vegetable? And hopefully it's not entirely clear, therefore, really playing on these morphological resemblances and showing these relationships, these kind of omnipresent forms that exist in the natural world. So as I was working on the isomorphology series of etchings for a couple of years at the Natural History Museum, towards the end, rather than looking at the object and just inquiring about the morphology of the object, I was really becoming a bit fascinated with the questions of formation. How did this form become this form? How did it develop? How did it grow? And Goethe has been quite an inspiration to me in terms of thinking about the natural world. He coined the term morphology in 1792. And so he says, if I look at the created object, inquire into its creation, and follow the process back as far as I can, I will find a series of steps. Since these are not actually seen together before me, I must visualize them in my memory so that they form a certain ideal whole. At first, I will turn to think of them in steps, but nature leaves no gaps. And thus, in the end, I'll have to see this progression of uninterrupted activity as a whole. I can do so by dissolving the particular without destroying the impression itself. And so this kind of became the way that then I was trying to look at the specimen and imagine its kind of life history without gaps, and think, oh, then my challenge and kind of question was well, how would I draw that? I can't see it, I can't observe it in the way that I'm observing and handling a specimen. So how on earth do I do that? So after a while thinking about it, this was in 2014, I developed a method called the isomorphology drawing game. So first, I took the isomorphology forms that we saw in 2D, I made them into 3D. I took a lot of action verbs, kind of developmental verbs from developmental biology and botanicals and things. So for example, you know, divide and twist and stretch and nucleate and branch and things like that. And I applied those verbs, kind of actions, to the form, and went round in this kind of like repetition with variation kind of cycle with all these different little, you know, kind of possible ways to change the system in a kind of algorithm recipe-like way of working. And I also took inspiration from Paul Clay's color gradation technique because I think that's a really nice way to represent change and also dimensionality. So here is a picture of my desk as I'm working on isomorphogenesis. There are no specimens here. It is, you know, I've just got my my kind of abstract form. The bits of paper, the colored bits of paper that you can see are the verbs that I've folded up and put in little pots, and then I'm picking them by chance to bring in a bit of surprise and, you know, to make it feel like a kind of drawing game. I mean, it was enjoyable. And then if you look at the form here, for example, that's a, you know, 3D cylinder, and then it's add nucleus and then twist and then multiply and bend and then add a tendril and slice and then change topology, so introduce a hole to the form. And then what's nice about this is that you can take both of the adult forms and you can marry them together to get a kind of progeny. And so in this way you can experiment with all kinds of kind of evolutionary ideas and developmental ideas, and that's lots of fun. So a little bit about the artistic motivation for this. Again, Goethe, inspiration, and his kind of idea about the primal plant, the Urflands. And he says, the primal plant is going to be the strangest creature in the world, which nature herself must envy me. With this model and the key to it, it will be possible to go on forever inventing plants and know that their existence is logical. That is to say, if they did not actually exist, they could, for they are not the shadowy phantoms of a vain imagination, but possess an inner necessity and truth. The same law will be applicable to all other living organisms. So I suppose what I really liked was, after having worked on the isomorphology project and kind of investigated all of these forms and patterns in nature, to then feel like it was possible to somehow, you know, take those patterns and you know, invent forms based on these principles of nature, you know, of development and of growth, and you know, through drawing then to kind of invent these theoretical morphologies, these, you know, possible plants and possible organisms that don't exist, but maybe they could, and that just felt really nice. And so this is an image of the Goethe's Urflands by Turpin. So this is another isomorphogenesis image. So in this way, isomorphogenesis simulates genesis in a quite, you know, in a very general way, and also, you know, in a kind of vacuum. It's just form evolving in a color, that's it. And then I became really interested in, well, you know, how could you represent specific developmental process? It's not just a kind of abstract general thing, but what about something like, you know, protein folding or cell division? So then this, you know, this was a new problem. So the problem was how to draw a biological process when there is no object. Then this led to a new project, and that was representing biology as process, which is an AHRC project with John Dupre, philosopher of science, and cell biologist James Wakefield at the University of Exeter. It's ongoing. We started in 2017. And also a new approach. So, you know, there's no specimens to draw from, nothing to directly observe as such. I mean, definitely working from a lot of kind of observations from, you know, scientific knowledge and things like that. But so I was embedded in the scientific and philosophy community at Exeter, where I still am. I've been shadowing scientists, attending lab meetings and lab practice. And then most importantly, I've been creating drawing labs. So this is sessions where I draw together with scientific labs and develop ideas. So this is an image of one of these drawing labs. They last about 2 hours and they're highly collaborative, and it's a combination of guided and improvised drawing experimentation. So the protein maze landscapes that were in the Botanical Mind, this is kind of where they started, and this is where we developed the ideas for these with the Phillips lab who work on protein dynamics here in the photograph. So we began experimenting with and drawing and adapting the underlying structure of a maze to parallel features of the protein folding landscape. So unfortunately, I can't go into full detail here because it would just take too long. But the more that we thought about the life of the protein and the kind of dynamics, the more that it seemed to make sense to think about it in this kind of I mean, people talk about the energy landscape of the protein as a funnel or a cone, and at the bottom of the cone is like this kind of minimal energy point where the protein is then folded, and somehow that seemed a bit like the center of a maze. So we started to think about the maze and to draw the maze. And then here we're getting a bit technical, but this is you know what we were doing. So so we're interested in the potential to sort of exploit this aspect of the maze, which is granularity. So in the outer ring here, so that's here, you can see there's fine granularity. This enables features of a protein folding landscape such as multiple entry points, steep descent, fusion and branching. Then, oh, hang on, in the middle here, you've got this intermediate kind of granularity, and that enables partially folded mature proteins, expression through turns, uphill and backwards travel, and fewer entry points. And then in the inner ring, this is much more coarse and enables protein folding, and this is the kind of minimum energy point. It's much more rough, and so there's less choice and fewer entry points. And so we really like this because it allows for both this kind of like chance behavior and also nonlinear pathways. So here we have some mazes, and what was really nice about this is that the maze structure becomes interactive through the drawing process. So it's not a kind of like, oh, let's take a protein and then let's like draw that protein. It's like, let's think about that protein's general behavior and then let's see how we could play that out by drawing that into a maze. So I made these drawings and then they become analogous to the kind of behavior of the protein landscape as it's, yeah. And so then this is one of the drawings that was in the Botanical Mind. And so here I think it's really nice to think of the maze as a kind of game and the drawer is the player. And, you know, there are just many ways to explore the maze, many solutions, and many ways to be like the protein. So color here stands in for dimension. These are very multi-dimensional processes, and these are two-dimensional drawings. So that's always going to be a challenge, but I think color is a really nice way to play with dimensionality. And then here, you know, you can see that this kind of like lower level activity leads to this folded protein at the center of the maze. So this kind of work then, you know, leads to more questions. So, you know, what is outside the maze? You know, is it free amino acids, relative chaos compared to the organization of the maze landscape? And we've just been drawing these kind of spiral pathways. So this on the left here, this is a drawing from a scientist from the Phillips lab. So she sent this to me after one of the labs and you know, was just asking, well, you know, what if the pathway was a kind of spiral form? And that actually made lots of sense for us, so we've been working on that. Also in the project, we've been working on cell division. So this is a series of drawings of mitosis, of cell division in lots of different organisms. So I should say actually that protein folding is really important in plants, and it's really important to cell division and to, you know, lots and lots of organisms. So so here we've got cell division. We're looking again at like different kind of states. So we're thinking about, you know, cancer and also different organisms, so plants and yeast and humans and flies. And And this is the work that's in the exhibition, Critical Zones. And also we've been working on embryogenesis, and here is some of the work. So this is a kind of like, it's a kind of abstract version of, well, I'm not gonna go into it. Yeah, and that was in the exhibition Holistic Science and Wisdom Tradition, which was also created by Gina at the Newland Art Gallery in 2019. So just to finish, hopefully we'll have a nice discussion, but you know, I suppose where we're going with this is, you know, it's just really thinking about drawing as a way of knowing biological process as a kind of process epistemology. So drawing to kind of infer, to create questions, drawing not to illustrate, but to be like biological process, to understand and to share understanding, and as a constructive method of collaborating with scientists. And so I was really interested, and I was saying to Claudia that the kind of sustainability and green drawing programs at the drawing school, I think one of the big questions is, you know, how do we draw processes that are involved in climate change and in weather systems? And I mean, that's something I'm very interested in, so we can leave it there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma. Really, really wonderful, and so fascinating to kind of be drawn through the evolution of your practice too. And one of the things I was struck by was the sort of element of play and the sort of game, and the way you were. I think you mentioned about using these developmental verbs, and I was just thinking you mentioned clay as one of your sort of inspirations alongside Goethe and his color gradation technique, and this sort of interplay between something very precise and carefully observed and this more playful quality, and just thinking how that feeds into this broader interplay between science and art. I know we talked a bit about, you know, the challenges and rewards of working with scientists, and, you know, the role of drawing in scientific understanding and how this has sort of changed over the years. But it'd be, yeah, interesting to think a bit more about this relationship. It's obviously a big question, the relationship between science and art, but in your experience of working with scientists, you know, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a nice quote from Clay, which is something like, you know, in terms of working with exactitude winged by intuition. And I really like that, because I think the more, you know, that we work on these drawing labs, I mean, research scientists have questions and they have, you know, their own lab experience, but, you know, research questions are research questions, and, you know, they're unknown, and they involve experimentation. And, you know, it's really interesting to use drawing to be part of that, because the kind of collective experience of drawing together, I think, is really, yeah, I mean, it's kind of wonderful to see, and it's quite, you know, seems to be quite meaningful to the scientists, and, you know, also to me, to, you know, to share these questions that, you know, are very important and sometimes quite personal, and to share them together, and then to explore them together through these kind of like drawing ideas, which is very rewarding.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, one thing that sort of, I suppose I've been thinking a lot about how in many ways artists through time seem to have intuited quite a few of the sort of discoveries, or so-called discoveries, that scientists have made in recent years, or plant scientists in particular, around plant communication systems, and just how sensitive plants are, and how communicative, and that sort of idea of communication, of plant-human communication, seems to come up in Gina's, in a lot of Gina's work, and a lot of the examples you've given, Gina. But I wondered particularly that the motif of the spiral, these spiral forms that have intrigued so many artists through time, and the ways in which that connects with Gemma's work on the maze and these kind of reoccurring patterns. Is there anything you'd like to bring in, Gina, from the exhibition there? I know we talked quite a bit about spiral forms and patterns when we were chatting before.
Yeah, I think you know, one of the things about those particular type of geometries that we call sacred, like fractals or the golden section, is that they're not just physical representations, they're metaphysical also. You know, within them is the embodiment of infinity, really. So if, you know, a fractal it has this characteristic of self-similarity within itself, which can extrapolate in either direction to infinity. So there's something implicit in the materiality, the material manifestation of these forms that speaks to something really deep within us, I think. And that, yeah, I would say that's why, you know, when you look at Neolithic stone carvings or Islamic art, or, you know, these forms are kind of omnipresent, really, because they're talking about something that's much more than decoration. You know, it's really about the origin of life. And yeah, I mean, I was just thinking when Gemma was revisiting the maze landscapes, because we actually haven't spoken about them for a while, but I don't know if you're familiar with Rupert Sheldrake's work, but
yeah,
you know, he speaks and writes about morphogenetic fields. And I was just thinking about you know, these landscapes as being kind of fields in a way. So that, you know, these fields which give rise to form. But I mean, I don't know about it well enough to really speak in depth, but my understanding is that it's a kind of field which pulls a form into existence. And when he speaks about it, he says that, you know, the morphogenetic field is very connected to healing, the healing function of bodies or plants. So I don't know if this is factually correct, but when you propagate a plant and you take you know, an element of it and it's able to kind of replicate itself, it's because it has within that part of the plant the ability to do that. So that's also a kind of healing function in a way. So I think, you know, when we're talking about like morphogenetic fields or these energy landscapes, there's something there which is about this kind of spirit matter interplay or relationship. So, you know, what is it that makes something more than just inert matter, but alive? And it is this thing which gives life, which I think is what's so interesting about Gemma's work, you know, that it's a visualization of life processes, of, you know, the things which really create the world around us. So yeah, it's abstract, so it's hard to talk about, but yeah,
and ways of drawing the invisible or the unseen in the seen. And I suppose the plant's such a lovely way of thinking about that, isn't it? With even just on a kind of obvious level of its roots being below the earth and the you know, so yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to make sure everyone listening is feels welcome to pose questions or speak directly. Now I know there's quite a few comments about people really enjoying the talk and wondering if it will be recorded. It will be recorded, so please feel free to revisit it on our website. But there's a question about from Jennifer Rylands on the circular drawings of protein folding pathways, and that she sees a reminiscent of Tibetan mandalas. Don't know if that's something you've thought about, Gemma.
Yeah, well, no, actually, I was just thinking that I did mean to say just that, I mean, you know, I really enjoyed the fact that they became mandala-like, and then the, you know, the mandala is an image for meditation and learning. Well, you know, it depends which kind of mandala, but and that actually felt really appropriate for these images because, you know, they were for us to meditate on, you know, the protein dynamics and you know, to learn more through the drawings. So yeah, thank you.
There's I mean, we have sort of touched on materials a little bit, and I know you have, Gemma, but and sort of different media, but there's a question around, you know, the limitations of 2D, and maybe we could broaden that to ask, kind of think more carefully about the kind of materials you're using and how that's changed over the course of your practice.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, that's a really good one, especially when you're working on a question like, you know, how to draw biological process, which is, you know, highly dynamic, multidimensional. And so, you know, maybe you think, well, a video is good or an animation or something. But in fact, I think there's something about being able to see the changes in a still image of development and of transformation that actually has a higher kind of benefit for understanding. And also I think that, you know, limitations are good, especially for someone like me who, you know, would never settle down unless they had something like a big limitation. So so I think 2D, I mean, I'm quite happy to stick with that. I think there are lots of ways to explore dimensionality within a two-dimensional image. And I mean, you know, analogies, metaphors, I mean, look at the work of Paul Klee. I mean, I consider him a morphologist and someone who worked on images that, you know, are pictorial versions of Genesis. And I mean, I haven't seen any videos or anything else that's convinced me that that's not the way to go. So yeah, I think drawing can do a huge amount. I mean, it's like, you know, this kind of idea from David Thistlewood and the people who developed the On Growth and Form exhibition at the ICA in 1951 of organic art. And, you know, if you think of the pictorial space as a kind of, yeah, a kind of, you know, basis for the development of an image to be more than just analogy to development and an actual, you know, act of creation to some extent. I think that's all really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, there's sort of a couple of comments about, you know, our bodies in relation to nature and the cosmos. So this sort of larger question of our place in the universe, I suppose, and our relationship with plants, which I suppose you've talked quite a bit about. Let's see, lots of comments flying in. So there's one question about, so images from both Gina and Gemma reminded me instantly of several outsider artists, several of them having little academic education or suffering some light or severe mental illness. Have you made that connection? I mean, Gina, you've talked about that a little bit about several outsider artists being drawn to plant life and plant forms, but do you want to give us some?
So we did look at Unica Zan's work actually in the research for the exhibition, but yeah, we weren't able to include everyone, unfortunately. But what really did emerge was not only these kind of spiral forms, which seem to fascinate a lot of outsider artists, which I think is really to do with the kind of impetus to life, this thing which drives life. So if you think of the vegetal kingdom, you know, it colonizes space wherever there's light and water, really. So there's something so primary about it, which I think is the kind of root of that fascination with these kind of vegetal forms. But the mandala was something which came up again and again. So it's interesting also thinking of Gemma's mazes in relation to Tibetan mandalas. And the thing about the mandala form, which is so interesting, is not only does it appear in nature, particularly in flowers, but also, you know, within Tibetan tradition in particular, it's a mind map. So it's a kind of cosmological model situating human consciousness or a consciousness at the center of a world which opens out from that point. So I think I couldn't really comment on any specific relationship between mental illness, but I would say there's definitely some an interesting relationship or kind of correspondence between these internal visualizations and then what becomes manifest in the material world. That, yeah, is a fascination not only to outsider artists, but, you know, contemporary artists and Bruce Conner, you know, these kind of figures that you wouldn't think would be working with that kind of stylistic idiom.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was wondering also about, you know, their relationship to, I mean, so many of us have been thinking about, you know, our really local environments over the last year now, going through various lockdowns and kind of working with materials or viewpoints or whatever that are close at hand. And I was just thinking about some of the artists in your exhibition, and if you were researching as much the kind of local the plant environments that they were inhabiting and drawing from, as much as their works. And for instance, Ethel Cahoon, thinking about her relationship with Cornwall and whether there were particular flora or traditions in Cornish botanical art or particular flora that she was interested in.
So I couldn't say about specific plants that she was interested in, but she does write about it. She wrote about having a particular kind of tree language that she developed. And Hilma F. Clint actually wrote something really beautiful about her study of the natural world, and how the first place that she would start would be with the plant kingdom, with the smallest elements like the mosses, the lichens, the ferns, and then moving up, and then going to the oceans and then to the sky. So it being this kind of quite primary source of fascination, I suppose.
Yeah, it's sort of reversing.
That would be interesting to do that.
Yeah. Sort of trace. And it's sort of interesting the way or the whole sort of, I suppose, the whole argument of your exhibition and what we've been talking about in a way reverses this sort of tradition, this the sort of philosophy of going right back to Aristotle, where plants are seen as kind of defective animals and sort of denigrators. In a way, you're sort of reversing that whole sort of hierarchy. Well, we've probably, there's so much scope for discussion, and I know many of you are keen to ask more questions and listen again. So please do listen on our website if you'd like to catch up on some of this discussion. But Gina, do you want to just tell us a little bit about where we might find the resources you've grouped together and kind of conversations you've grouped together online? Just so
absolutely, yeah. So when we were supposed to open the exhibition back in April last year, we went into lockdown. So we put a lot of the research material underpinning the exhibition online. So it's at botanicalmind.online. You can also link through to that from Camden Art Centre's website. There's also a lot of material on Camden Art Centre's website itself. So installation images, a walkthrough film of the exhibition with myself and Martin Clark. But the Botanical Mind Online is really a repository of a series of podcasts that we commissioned with different thinkers. So a Gaian ecologist, an alchemist, but plant biologists, and all sorts of thinkers. So do delve in there, and there'll be people that can speak in much more depth about the subjects that we just touched on this evening.
I highly recommend it to everyone. Well, thank you so much, Gina and Gemma. It's been really fantastic to discuss botanical minds, plant life and art with you both, and thanks for all your comments and questions to everyone listening. Thank you.
Thank you.